Thank you, Kristen, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Marietta for the extraordinary exhibition, which I hope everyone has already seen, in which there's a book of Vittoria Colonna's, which we'll be talking about later, and to Paige for organizing everything so well. Just a quick note that I'm going to be talking till around 2, and then I'm going to have 15 minutes for questions, and then I have to run off to teach a class at Brandeis. So that's the schedule for today. So let's get started. I'm going to start with a little bit of background. I'm assuming that you know nothing about Vittoria Colonna. If you do know something about her, you can forgive me for reviewing her biography, but I want to familiarize everyone with this extraordinary person. So this is the earliest and most widely recognized portrait of Colonna that we have, painted by Sebastiano del Piombo, who was a good friend of Michelangelo's. We'll be talking about him later. I think this is an interesting portrait to look at because, hold on, you can see that she's pointing her finger at you can't tell, but it's a book of poems, and you also can't tell that it's one of her own poems. So to paint a woman as a writer pointing at her own book of poems was a revolutionary event in itself, and it shows us that it's not only now that we recognize her as a major figure, but that even her contemporaries were honoring her as a poet long before this was painted, some years before any of her poems were published. We'll get back to that. So this is the most famous portrait of her. Vittoria Colonna was born in 1490 into a very fancy family in Renaissance Italy. On her father's side, the Colonna dated back to the 11th century. They had popes and cardinals and lots of money behind them. They controlled much of the territory to the east of Rome, known as the Castelli Romani. This is where modern popes have their sort of getaway, where Benedict was living, after he resigned from being pope. And they had around 14 castles in that area. She was born in one of those castles in a town called Marino. So her father was a member of a very powerful family and was involved in ruling the Kingdom of Naples. On her mother's side, you might recognize her grandparents. These are her mother's parents, so they sort of speak for themselves. But her mother grew up at the famous court in Urbino, where Castiglione wrote the famous book, The Book of the Courtier. So she came from the highest possible pedigree in Renaissance Rome. This is an image of her wedding contract, and I'm showing it to you partially just to convey, and it's a little hard to get density when you're showing a book, but I think you can see it's around 28 pages long, written in Latin, and some of it is written in Italian. I got to take this picture myself when I visited the family archive in Subiaco, which is outside of Rome, around an hour away. This is a monastic library. There are actually 2 monasteries there. One is where Benedict received his first vision before he started the Benedictine order. But the point of this document is simply to say that when she got married, it was not a kind of small domestic affair, but like negotiating a treaty with another country. She married the Spanish nobleman named Ferrante d'Avalos. His family was actually ruling the Kingdom of Naples. You might not have ever even known there was a Kingdom of Naples. I'm not sure I knew before I started working on her. But the Spanish were ruling Naples, Sicily. A whole stretch of southern Italy was under Spanish control during this time. And so the Colonna family arranged this marriage when she was 3 or 4, her husband was 4 or 5, between these powerful Roman nobles and one of the leading dynastic families from the Kingdom of Aragon. They were Aragonese rulers. So this is just to give you a glimpse of the seriousness of this union between the two of them. Here's a portrait of her husband, which is attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. It's not 100% sure he painted it, but the fact that she's being painted by, Sebastiano del Piombo, or her husband's being painted by Leonardo, many of the relatives were being painted by Titian. That's the world, that's the milieu that we're dealing with here. So moving now on to her poems, which is what I'm going to be focused on today, or in the context of Michelangelo, as we'll get to. This is the front page, the cover, the title page of the book of poems that changed literary history in Italy until this book was published, and it was published in 1538. There had never been a book of poetry or literature of any kind, except for some prayers. There had never been a book published by a woman, authored by a woman, in Italian history. That in itself is a landmark event. This then ushered in, so in 1538, when this book was published, no woman had ever published a book of poems. By 1599, so by the end of the century, over 200 women had published poems in Italy. So there was an absolute, outpouring of poetry written by Italian women in the wake of Vittoria Colonna, and very often referring back to her as having paved the way. So she was really a literary pioneer. Just to give you a sense of how extraordinary that is, in England, 3 women had published poems by the end of the 16th century. In France, I think the figure is 17, either 15 or 17, I think 17. So Italy was way ahead of the curve. There's really no comparison. And there are lots of reasons for that, and we could talk about that. But it's important just to note that Vittoria Colonna was the one who broke that particular glass ceiling. You'll notice that this cover page is very modest. There's nothing fancy about it at all. The title, Ramie, literally means rhymes, so it's just poems, basically. You'll notice that she's called La Divina Vittoria Colonna, the divine Vittoria Colonna, so that was a compliment being thrown at her. Her title is there. She was the Marchesa of Pescara, so they're recognizing her aristocratic title. What you can't know by looking at this, and what's important to the story, is that the book was published against her will. So she did not give permission. It's what we call a pirated edition. There was no such thing as copyright for several hundred years. And she never consented to the publishing of her poems in her life. So in the aftermath of this first edition, which was published in 1538, there were 12 editions of her poems published before her death 9 years later in 1547. So between 1538 and 1547, her poems were published in 12 different editions with some changes in them, but she never consented to any of those publications. So that in itself is interesting. So when we think about her as having, broken the glass ceiling, as having transformed the literary landscape in Europe, we also have to keep in mind that this was against her will, that she didn't will it, she protested it, and yet didn't stop it. So there's a lot of interesting conversation about this. In other words, someone as powerful as she was, maybe they could have gotten away with the first edition, but she certainly had the power to stop the presses. She was friends with the Pope. So, she could have done that. So the question is this just a sort of modesty, topos of a woman? In England we refer to the stigma of print, that you don't want to kind of allow your poetry to be published, but you're quietly supporting it. There's no clear answer. But just to give you a sense of the circumstances in which this happened, here is just a single quotation from the prefatory letter, the dedicatory letter of the publisher. This is my translation. I present you with the sonnets of the divine Pescara, whom I have personally collected over a long period of time. I have had the great desire to publish them, even if it goes against the wishes of so great a lady, for I consider it less of an error to displease one woman, however rare and great, than to deny so many men what they want. So, I need hardly say much about this. But the sexual gender politics here are very obvious. Interestingly, we have some evidence that it was women who were, many women who were reading Colonna's poems, not just men, but the idea that this man in the city of Parma was privately collecting her poems, meaning the poems were circulating, and this is something that I always need to explain very carefully to my students, that there were sort of two different ways in which materials were circulating in the 15th and 16th centuries. One was printed books, and that we can trace in one way, but the other was in manuscript, so handwritten copies. And there were many manuscript copies of Vittoria Colonna's poems, and she was actively sharing them with her own friends in her own circles. So when Piragallo says that he's personally collected over a long time, that means anytime he had a chance to copy out the poems that someone else might have of hers, he was doing that. And that means that this book that he's published has no real authority. It's not as if it was, you know, here's my manuscript that I'm handing over to the publisher and I want you to go publish it. It was, someone was coming through Parma and I copied these 3 sonnets, I got another 5 from here, and it is full of errors. So Kristen mentioned that I had translated, this is the book that I translated. I published it 2 years ago. The first time it's ever been translated into English. I translated 145 sonnets, and of those 145 sonnets, at least 7 of them were not written by Colonna, meaning he got the wrong ones. Other poems she ultimately improved or changed. So this is by no means a definitive edition of her poems. It was a marketing opportunity for him. It was a business opportunity. As he says here, many people, supposedly many men, wanted to read these poems, so he got it into print. Okay, just to give you a sample page so you can see what it looks like. This is the watermarks wouldn't have been there, but you can see that there were 2 sonnets per page. This is a small book, sort of like a paperback that we would have, and this is a copy from a library in Austria, but there is a copy of this first edition at the Houghton Library at Harvard. In the exhibition that many of you will have already seen here at the MFA, there's a 1542 copy of her poems. In that edition, there are also religious poems that she wrote. The 1538, this edition has almost exclusively poems that she wrote after the death of her husband. She was widowed at the age of 35, and she wrote over 100 sonnets to her dead husband about her loss of her husband, idealizing him, idealizing a marriage. That was actually a terrible marriage, but it got better after he died. And so, you know, these things happen. So she wrote posthumous poetry, and for any of you who have studied Dante or Petrarch, you will know that the idea of writing poems to a dead beloved was a very strong tradition in Renaissance Italy. She was the first woman to do this in a systematic way, and unlike the men who were doing this usually to women that they either didn't know or certainly weren't married to, she wrote her sonnets to her husband. So she was actually, you know, a widow grieving her husband. Instead of saying, she also said prayers to him, but in addition to saying prayers, her primary vehicle for her grief was poetry. Okay, so I'm going to share with you one facet of her life in a little bit of detail today. We don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to talk about her relationship with Michelangelo, who's someone that everyone I know is interested in, or many people are interested in. Here's a portrait of Michelangelo attributed to Sebastiano del Piombo, who painted the portrait of Vittoria that we looked at the beginning. I want to talk about Michelangelo not only because he and Vittoria Colonna had an extraordinary relationship that's worth knowing about, but because what joined them together gives us insight into the art really of both of them, the art in the largest sense in terms of letters and art, and specifically touches on something that many people don't know much about, which is the nascent and ultimately shut down Protestant Lutheran movement in Italy at the time that Colonna and Michelangelo were becoming friends in the 1530s and 40s. So we don't know how Vittoria Colonna and Michelangelo first met. There's some evidence that there might have been an introduction before the materials we're going to be looking at in a minute, but she did commission a painting from Michelangelo before they met in 1531, and she asked for him to paint her a painting of the Mary Magdalene, and this is, as you will see, this is a painting by Pontormo. So why am I showing this to you? Because Pontormo executed, meaning finished, the painting that Michelangelo began as a drawing. Pontormo and Michelangelo were also good friends. We're told that Vittoria Colonna commissioned this painting from Michelangelo, who was busy. He had various commissions he was working on at the time, and said he didn't have time to do it. So he did the drawing, and Pontormo finished it, and this is the painting that he made. That was before they knew each other. That was in 1531, but it's interesting to imagine this sort of prehistory. She also commissioned, she was obsessed with the Mary Magdalene at this moment. She also commissioned a painting from Titian of the Mary Magdalene, which he did complete, and which is in the Uffizi in Florence. Anyway, by October of 1538, so around 7 years after this commission, this early commission was done, we have a very odd and sort of quirky set of records that came from a Portuguese miniature painter named Francisco de Holanda, who was visiting Rome in 1538, and he wrote up a weird, it's amazing that he did this. It's a gift to us. It's not clear what was motivating him at the time, but he wrote up a record of conversations he had with Michelangelo and Vittoria Colonna at the church of San Silvestro al Quirinale in Rome, where all of them together were attending the equivalent of this lecture series. They were attending a lecture series, a series of they weren't sermons, they called them lectures actually, given by a priest on the epistles of St. Paul. So every week they would go to this church, San Silvestro in Quirinale. They would listen to a lecture or a lesson on the epistles of St. Paul's, and afterwards people would gather in the little courtyard in the little garden behind the church and have conversations. So this Portuguese miniature painter who was present at this event kept meticulous record of the conversations that went on in those gatherings, and tells us a lot about the relationship that Michelangelo and Vittoria Colonna had at the time. As he described it, the two friends were very casual, were very informal together. Vittoria was asking Michelangelo a set of often prying questions, in fact, which Michelangelo didn't really want to answer. One of these questions that is interesting, and she might have meant it to be provocative, I think she probably did, she asked him why Flemish painting was more devout than Italian. And this pulled Michelangelo out of his reticent shell and got him to defend his own Italian art. So he supposedly said, only works that are done in Italy can we call, in effect, true painting. The fact that they were discussing this particular topic, what culture in Europe at the time produced the most devout forms of art, gets to the heart of their connection to one another. This was a friendship born out of a shared commitment to the relationship between art and religion, between art and faith. More surprisingly for those of us who associate Michelangelo with the Vatican, with the popes, the particular form of faith that Michelangelo and Vittoria Colonna were both passionately interested in was not the Catholicism that they'd grown up with, but the Lutheranism that was sweeping much of Europe at the time and making surprising inroads into pockets, different pockets of Italy. So I want to talk a little bit about a few of their exchanges, which involve different genres and media, letters, drawings, poems, just to give you a sense of what these two extraordinary people were talking about, what they were interested in, and how this question of what kind of art, in the broadest sense, best captures religious faith. So there are 3 drawings of Michelangelo's that we know of, which he made specifically as gifts for Vittoria Colonna. One of the 3, meaning that there are references to them, one of the 3, unfortunately, is lost, and that is a drawing on the subject of the Samaritan woman. But I'm going to just talk for a few minutes about the exchanges that the 2 of them had surrounding the other 2 drawings that have thankfully survived. So the first, many of you will recognize this, is the Pietà, which we have here in Boston at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum around the corner. This was a gift that Michelangelo made for Colonna, apparently as a request. She requested this, and we know this from Michelangelo's first biographer, Ascanio Condivi, in his Life of Michelangelo. He said that Michelangelo made at the wish of his lady. And just pausing there, the fact that Condivi refers to Vittoria Colonna as his lady, I mean, that's the level of intimacy between these people. And I should just pause again to say this was definitely not a romantic relationship. It was not a sexual relationship. Michelangelo wasn't interested in women. Vittoria Colonna wanted to be a nun. There was there's no suggestion in any of the documents, in any of the archives, that this relationship was anything but platonic. But that doesn't make it any less intimate. And she was his lady when she died. He went into mourning for 3 years, and he came to see her on her deathbed. So this was the most profound relationship Michelangelo had with a woman. So Condivi says that Michelangelo made at the wish of his lady a naked Christ when he was taken down from the cross, and his dead body would have fallen at the feet of his most holy mother if it were not supported by the arms of 2 little angels. So he's describing this painting. I think you can see this, not painting, this drawing. You can see the 2 angels, the body of Christ, obviously, and Christ's mother. At around the same time that Colonna made this request for Michelangelo to paint her a Pietà, she herself was writing a meditation, a long meditation, in this case in prose, not in poetry, on the same subject. So we have this vision of the 2 of them working together on the Pietà. In other words, in their different media, she writing a piece of literature, he was doing a drawing for her. Behind that, there's a Protestant preacher in England who had to escape to Switzerland, Bernardo Ochino, who was preaching on the subject. So you get this vision of a cluster, a kind of intellectual circle, where people were working on this, how to think about the Pietà from a reformed, from a more Lutheran perspective. Her work was published after her death in 1556. This is the title page, and that's the translation of the title. The Pianto, that's the weeping of the Marchesa di Pescara, that's her title, on the Passion of Christ, published 1556, so that's 9 years after her death. But written, we have lots of evidence written simultaneously with Michelangelo's drawing. So who was inspiring whom, it's not clear, but they were both thinking about this. Just to give you a brief excerpt, you can see, you can hear, hopefully, the resonances between what Michelangelo did in his drawing and what Colonna was writing about. The day of Venus, Venerdì, and the late hour moved me So venerdì is the Italian word, for Friday. I feel like until I read this letter, I hadn't fully registered that Friday was named after Venus, so I'm just pointing that out. The day of Venus and the late hour move me, so this is Colonna writing here, move me to write of the moving scene of seeing Christ dead in the arms of his mother. So did she have Michelangelo's drawing in front of her? Is that why she asked for it? Was he inspired by her? We don't know, but you can, again, see the echoes between these things. I see the sweet mother whose breast is full of the most ardent compassion, tied so deeply to the love of her son. And then just a couple lines later in that text, she says, the Virgin, I think this is an amazing statement, especially if I'll go back to the drawing, the Virgin has made of her nearly dead body a sepulcher in that hour. That the Virgin, that Mary's body has become like a grave to capture the body of her son. So that is the sort of conversation that we can recover around Michelangelo's Pietà drawing, a very strong example of mutual interest, of inspiration going in directions that we can't entirely qualify or predict, but I think what's important here, people used to refer to Vittoria Colonna, if anyone had heard of her, exclusively as Michelangelo's muse, as if she were sort of passive, lofty figure who, he, painted or wrote to, but anyone who takes this material seriously, if you dig into this material, you see that, she was giving as good as she got. These two were in direct dialogue all the time. In fact, she was more guiding him, I would say, if anyone was leading the way. She had much more religious education than he did, and he leans on her on multiple instances for her erudition. Okay, so I want to just look at the second drawing that he made for her, which is probably less familiar, but some of you may have seen this, either reproduced or in London. This is the Christ on the Cross that is held at the British Museum. Here we have a very rich and interesting set of letters between the two of them on this subject of this drawing. So here's the letter itself, just so you can see what her handwriting looks like. Interestingly, I've gone through hundreds of her letters. The only people she wrote to by hand were Michelangelo and her brother. So, in other words, otherwise she had secretaries, professional secretaries, and she often would sign her name at the bottom of a letter to verify that it was hers. Sometimes she added a postscript, but she didn't pick up pen and paper and write her own letters, except, as I say, to the two sort of closest people in her life, Michelangelo and her brother. So here's the letter. Here's the translation. My dearest Michelangelo, I beg you to send me the crucifix for a little while, even if it's not finished, because I want to show it to the gentlemen who have come from the Most Reverend Cardinal of Mantova. And if you're not busy with work today, he was like finishing the, Sistine Chapel. If you're not busy with work today, you might come to talk to me at your leisure. And then I think my favorite part of the letter, yours to command, right? She just told him, drop everything, give me the drawing you're working on, stop painting for the Pope, and then yours to command, the Marchesa di Pescara. Okay, so this really, really angered Michelangelo, this letter. He got actually quite upset, and what's sort of fun about this is we have all the pieces so we can see it. So he wrote back to her, here's the letter, I just wanted to show you what his handwriting looked like, and actually this is sort of interesting. So this is his letter. His handwriting, by the way, is significantly better than hers. Hers is really hard to read. It took me a long time to learn to read her handwriting. His is very clean. But I want to point out that you'll see that he turned the page this way, and here I don't know if you can tell, there are suspiciously 14 lines. There's a sonnet. And this is actually a sonnet that he wrote to her. So paper in the Renaissance was very expensive. You didn't waste a piece of paper. This kind of thing is a sign of being a wasteful aristocrat. To leave all of that blank at the bottom of the page, that's unusual. But anyone who's ever had a chance to look at any of Michelangelo's papers at the show at the Met or other occasions will know that Michelangelo used every corner of every piece of paper. On the back of this might be, some drawings of arms or heads. But anyway, this piece of paper was clearly marked, Vittoria Colonna. So here's a draft of the letter, and then here's a sonnet that he was working on for her, and they are actually have a very interesting relationship to each other, which I'll get to in a little bit. So that's what the original draft looked like. Here is a translation. Signora Marchesa, given that I am myself in Rome, there was no need to leave the crucifix with Mr. Tommaso and to make him a messenger between your ladyship and me, your servant, especially since I serve you and have the most desire possible to do more for you than for any man whom I've ever known in the world. Okay, so we're not entirely sure what this conversation is about the intermediary, but the point is she's already insulted him. She's gotten someone else involved. She says she wants to show it to, as she said here, to the gentleman from Mantova, and he says, I don't care about the gentleman from Mantova. I would do anything for you if you asked me. I serve you and have the most desire possible to do more for you than for any man whom I've ever known in the world. But the demanding work that I've taken on in the Vatican, and am still involved in, has not permitted me to make this known to your ladyship. And although it may have seemed that I had forgotten, I was doing what I did not talk about in order to deliver a surprise. Okay, we've all had this experience. You're planning a great surprise for your child, your partner, whatever, and it gets asked for the day before. So he's really, really upset, okay? He says, I didn't talk about it in order to deliver a surprise, but my purpose has been spoiled. And the Italian there is really interesting. The word that this translator translates for purpose is disegno, which, as the word sounds in English, is design. And design can be both the drawing itself that he was making. You've ruined my drawing, and you've ruined my intention. You've ruined what I wanted to give to you. The word spoiled is the Italian word guasto, which means like busted, like a toilet in Italy or a gas station where it's broken. It says guasto. You'll see a sign on it. Guasto means like it's broken up. You've ruined it. So by asking me for something I was planning to give you in my own time, as a surprise, as a gift, you've taken away the pleasure of the gift. That's what he's saying. So he's angry. He's upset. He's declared the drawing in effect, and the gift have been ruined. And then after this sort of squabble, we can glimpse her sort of recovery of this, her re-elevating of it. This is her next letter to him. She says, I've seen the crucifixion, so she got the drawing, which certainly has crucified in my memory whatever other pictures I've ever seen, nor could I imagine a design better made, more alive, or more beautifully executed. Certainly I could not ever explain how subtly and wonderfully it is made. I've looked at it well in the light and with a magnifying glass and a mirror, and I never saw anything more perfectly done. So this is, I think, a rather elegant, interesting way of recovering the situation. She's not responding to the accusations of theft and ruining the drawing, but she's taking it with the utmost seriousness and paying the utmost respect to it, and also showing us again, that she's not a sort of passive recipient of the gift, but she's actively engaging in learning from it, right? That she's examining it with a magnifying glass, she's looking in a mirror, she's trying to get angles on it, that she says all other images of the crucifixion have now been crucified in her mind. This is the only one that will remain there. She has fully internalized it and made it her own, and that is a very Protestant thing to do, that you see the Christ figure inside of you, that you don't need to see the art. And then she goes on, she says, the things you've done necessarily excite the judgment of anyone who looks at them. And after seeing them, I can speak with real experience of the possibility of adding goodness to perfect things. And I have seen that omnia possibilia sunt credenti, all things are possible for one who believes. I had the greatest faith in God that he would give you a supernatural grace to make this Christ. Then I saw it to be so marvelous that it surpassed all my expectations. The language specifically about grace, supernatural grace, again, is very Protestant. It's the kind of thing that the Catholic Inquisition didn't like, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But so this is the level of the, I wouldn't say compliment, but of, I mean, it's certainly compliment, but also of deep connection with the art that he's making. Here's the letter itself, just so you can see, again, her long scrawl, all written in her own hand. Now, around the time of these exchanges about the two drawings, about the Pietà and the crucifixion drawing, this was 1540 to 1541, Vittoria prepared a gift of her own for Michelangelo, and that was a manuscript of her spiritual sonnets. There are 103 of them, which she gave to him as a gift. This manuscript is currently held in the Vatican, in the Biblioteca Apostolica, the Vatican Library. It's one of their very precious books among many, and it's the only original copy that we have. Unlike the 1538 poems, which were mostly, as I said, love poems to her dead husband, this was a collection of poems that she made for him. She had it professionally written out. She didn't write it out herself, but she curated it. She edited this edition. And the only response directly we have from him about those poems comes in a letter that he wrote to her, and he says, "Before taking possession, Signora, of the things which your ladyship has several times wished to give to me," so before you gave me this gift, "I wanted, in order to receive them as little unworthily as possible, to execute something for you by my own hand." So this suggests that one of these drawings, or it could be a drawing that we've lost, he was preparing to give her, to kind of anticipate her gift to him so that they could, each be exchanging something with the other. Then I came to realize that the grace of God cannot be bought, and that to keep you waiting is a grievous sin. So this puts the other exchange in an interesting light, where he was keeping her waiting, but he was intending to keep her waiting. Here he says, to keep you waiting was a grievous sin. I confess my fault and willingly accept the things in question. The things, the Italian phrase is le cose, like literally the things. And we generally assume that he's referring to the poems because there's no other evidence of her giving him anything, and there's direct evidence that she gave him this gift at the exact time that he's writing this. But that's the only clear reference that we have between them of the exchange. There is an amazing other letter that he wrote to his nephew at the time, where he says that the divine Vittoria Colonna has given him a beautiful gift of her poems, he says, written on the smoothest paper possible, on the most beautiful pages. And it is the case that I hadn't seen that letter ever when I I've only gotten to touch this book once at the Vatican, but when I did, it felt like marble. It was the smoothest paper I've ever felt. I mean, it was vellum, but it's incredibly smooth. So the idea that she must have chosen the paper for him. In other words, she chose this incredibly expensive, smooth paper, which he then acknowledged and recognized and appreciated in a separate context. Okay, so here he says that, he's worrying about how you receive grace and whether you can merit it or deserve it. And again, this is, anyone who studied any Protestantism will recognize these are central questions of debate between Protestants and Catholics, and he's coming in a very Protestant, on a very Protestant side here, that you can't ever earn God's grace, that nothing that humans do has any merit to it, that we receive, we don't perform works. Catholicism, always believed in the power of works, and Protestantism canceled that out, and Luther especially. And then all of this shows up, in effect, I'm just showing you this kind of complicated web between them of different kinds of art, thinking about these questions. This turns up now in a sonnet that she wrote for him, meaning to him. So she gave him all of these poems, but the poems were addressed to Christ, to her own religious, they weren't written as personal poems to him. But this poem was written to him. And she says, I will not, this is my translation of this poem, I will not say to you, my sweet comfort, that the place or time or hour is not right to reveal with works so great a passion, which is the desire I carry within. But if this or that little diversion distracts my senses from honoring you always, I have through your grace a firm heart and never direct my sail towards other ports. I now understand that in this world, pricks and thorns cannot turn the right foot of the wise man from his straight path if he foresees its end, but our great self-love, our weak faith in those high and holy invisible things slow down our progress towards salvation. And interestingly, this poem, the reference to turning the right foot of the wise man, is a response to a poem he wrote for her that begins, now on my right foot, now on my left. So it's directly echoing that. So she's taking Michelangelo's poem, not just responding to it, but also correcting it a bit, correcting it theologically, making sure that he understands the limits of human achievement, our great self-love. That translation of mine maybe doesn't convey how negative that is, our narcissism, our concern with ourselves instead of with God, our weak faith, slow down our progress towards salvation. So what's interesting about this and about many of these exchanges is it's a real dilemma to be a Protestant artist in many ways, because your works, your religious works, don't count in some ways. Don't count meaning you're not gaining credit, as it were. But what we see, both of them, and very, very focused on Vittoria Colonna, was that her poems, her religious poems, and the way she reads Michelangelo's drawings for her are ways for her to intensify her faith. So it's not about producing objects that gain you credit in the world, but it's about deepening your inner faith, deepening your relationship to God without the intermediary of a priest, of someone between you and God. And so both of them had a very intense sense of this. And you see, there are many examples like this. You see her sort of instructing him in what it would mean to be a good Protestant. Okay, so I'm just, in the last couple of minutes, just want to have a sort of coda to this. This is exactly the kind of position, what I just outlined in a poem like this, that got Vittoria Colonna into tremendous trouble after her death. 25 years after she died in 1547. 25 years later, she was, charges were brought against her by the Inquisition. So she died just as the Council of Trent was going on, and the Council of Trent was the Catholic response to the Reformation. It issued what history books often call the Counter-Reformation, but it's sort of doubling down on Catholic theology and a rejection of many of the sort of Lutheran Reform tendencies which were actually circulating in Italy. We never think of Italy as coming very close to having a reformation of its own, but it really did. And just one sort of striking data point on that is Vittoria Colonna, after her husband died, really fell in love emotionally with two different men, both of whom were homosexual, Michelangelo on the one hand, and then with a cardinal, Reginald Pole, a British man, nephew of Henry VIII, who spent his career in Italy because he refused to support Henry's divorce and sort of fled. So this figure, Reginald Pole, who was born in England, had been a Protestant, rose to such prominence in the Catholic Church that he almost became Pope. He lost by one vote becoming Pope. And his theology was boilerplate Protestant. Okay, so Italy almost had an English Protestant Pope. He then went back to England and became Archbishop of Canterbury. So the same person, within a space of 5-10 years, could have been Pope and Archbishop of Canterbury. So that just shows you. But precisely around that time, he was put on trial by the Inquisition. He died before he could serve. Many of their friends were executed. And Vittoria Colonna actually moved in her last years of her life to the city of Viterbo, north of Rome, to live in this Protestant circle with Reginald Pole. Michelangelo was visiting, they were writing to each other, so there was a really active Protestant movement. Anyway, she died in 1547, and 25 years later, around 1572, there was a trial, a posthumous trial, prepared against her by the Inquisition, which focused on her being a Lutheran. I'm going to show you that this is the kind of photograph that could get me in trouble at the Vatican, but I want to show that I did it. So this is an illegal photograph taken by me inside the secret archive of the Inquisition at the Vatican. And this is her file. It's not all hers, but like the first half of it. And in there are actual letters of hers underlined with marginal notes by the censors. When she says, referring to things like this, when she says, our weak faith doesn't mean anything, when she refers to God's grace, that smacks of the Lutheran heresy of sola fide, of faith alone. When she says we will meet again, in heaven, that smacks of her belief in predestination, and so on. So they went through all of her letters and were underlining things to get her moved from wherever she was in the afterlife down into hell. That was the goal. There's, in the ancient Roman world, there was such a thing as a damnatio memoriae, a damnation of your memory, that after someone died, you could sort of poison, shame them, you could shift their fame. And this was sort of absorbed by the Catholic Church into these posthumous trials where, their jurisdiction, they thought, extended. So instead of helping someone move out of purgatory towards heaven, you could also have downward mobility. So there was a damnatio memoriae. Anyway, just to sort of entice you with this little story, the trial never took place. They prepared all these documents, as I say, with it's really like notes that, a scholar would take, underlining and then making marginal comments about her perfidious Lutheranism. But it never took place. No one knows why. And her file, these papers were lost for more than 400 years until the late 20th century, when a priest was given access to the archive. So this is a special archive in a secret building in the back of, a palazzo in the Vatican, which is where all of the Inquisition records are. And there was a priest given access to that because he was going to study and release the Galileo trials. So Galileo was also put on trial, as you know, by the Inquisition, and he was given permission. Anyway, he just accidentally pulled down the wrong book, and he opened it up and found all of this material about Vittoria Colonna, whom he'd never heard of. By great luck, he mentioned this to a colleague of his who worked in Renaissance literature, and she was astonished because for hundreds of years people had heard that there had been a trial prepared. Anyway, that woman, along with someone else, got permission to transcribe it. And so it got published in a very sort of official publication inside the Vatican that is not widely circulated. But it was unearthed. It was brought out. So what's interesting about this is just the confirmation that in the 16th century, they thought this woman, this aristocratic woman, who was the first woman to publish a book of poems in Italy, who had lots and lots of sort of the highest connections to everyone in the land, was thought dangerous enough dead that they were putting her on trial for her Lutheran beliefs. So, okay, it's 1:59. I'm going to stop there so we have 10, 15 minutes for questions. Thank you guys all for being here. I'm not sure, do we need microphones for questions, or do people just?
Yes,
Okay,
we have
there's
mics.
someone down here, yeah. Yeah, I think she's, oh wait, they're going to give you
Yeah, microphone.
Thank you. Test. How do you briefly characterize the arrival in Italy of this Reformation and Lutheranism you're speaking of, and why do I or us not know so little about it?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's really interesting. I'm also, until I was working on this material, I knew nothing about it. But it really came from two different sources, or probably more. But the two streams. One was Luther's works themselves started to circulate. So they were in Italy. One of Vittoria Colonna's closest friends was the French Queen of Navarre, Marguerite de Navarre, who was a French Protestant and who had Luther's works translated as they were being written into French, because she didn't read German. So, you know, there was a connection there with France, with French Catholics. There was a Spanish reformer named Valdez who was in Naples because of this Spanish Neapolitan access, and he started a group formed around him called the Spirituali, like the spirituals. He was also being accused of heresy and was being chased out of Spain by the Spanish Inquisition, but found his way into Naples. So in Naples, there was a group of religious reformers. There was this Reginald Pole figure who came over from England. There was Marguerite de Navarre, who, by the way, was friends with Catherine Parr, and Queen Elizabeth translated Marguerite de Navarre's Protestant poem for Catherine Parr for her New Year's gift. So, I mean, you have these three queens. I mean, you know, so it is extraordinary. So it's like groundswell. Right under the surface, there was tremendous Protestant fervor. And, you know, I mean, I've written 2 books about the Protestant Reformation. I'd never heard anything about this, so I started working on Italy. So it's a really strange lapse in our general, the history that most of us get taught, even at high levels. I'd never heard anything about this. But if you do dig into Italian 16th century history, you hear about these different groups. So there's the most common explanation is it's coming down from the north, that Lutheran, you know, there was a whole group of figures inside the Catholic Church at the time who were interested in Luther. But then there's the Neapolitan figure, and there are other Italians who started to get interested. So they actually appointed in, I'm going to guess, I'll say like 1542, it might have been a year or two later, there was a committee formed inside the Vatican to work on accommodating Lutheranism inside Catholicism. So like they were actively trying to compromise and make a kind of consensus theology. And then, you know, that pope died, the next pope came in and was super right-wing and so on. So it faded. But it's a really interesting moment where history could have gone in a very different direction. Any other questions?
Did she have any children?
It's an interesting question. She did not have any children. So she was married to her husband for 16 years before he died. He was killed as a result of battle wounds fighting the King of France. He actually took the King of France prisoner. And so she was 35 when she became a widow. In those days, that was considered pretty late to be able to have a child, but she still could have remarried. During the marriage, they were very often apart because her husband was a soldier. But in several of her poems, she refers to their sterility. And actually, more specifically, she refers to her own sterility, which, of course, it could have been him. We have no idea where the problem was. But she refers to the fact that they didn't have children. And that, as you might know, is a total disaster for a dynastic marriage of this kind. But what's really interesting is it was the best thing that could have happened to her, because it meant when her husband died, all of the dowry, all of the money came to her. If she'd had a son, she would have been passing the fortune on. So she found herself in 1525, at the age of 35, in an extraordinary position for a woman during this period. She had no children that she needed to take care of. She didn't need to get remarried, and she was completely independent. Her parents were dead. She had inherited all the money that had been put aside for her portion, should her husband predecease her. And there were many attempts to get her remarried because she was a very desirable widow with all that money, with the prestige and so forth. And she refused. And not only did she refuse, but as I sort of briefly alluded to, she declared she wanted to become a nun. So that's another, it's another really fascinating question. This woman wanted to be a nun, but ends up becoming a Lutheran heretic, right? That these things that don't feel compatible, but at the time they were not incompatible. And that's what's interesting, that there was nothing incompatible to her about wanting to devote her life living in a nunnery and get out of the political world and get out of the marriage market. There was nothing incompatible with that, and saying, as she did, and it got her in trouble, that her favorite book of all books that had been written in the modern era for her was Luther's commentary on the Bible. So she loved Luther. And then just one note about this. So she wanted to become a nun, and she actually moved into a nunnery in Rome. And this is a sort of amazing thing. The Pope Clement VII, wrote a letter that has survived to the abbess at the nunnery and said, I understand that, Vittoria Colonna is living with you. Please treat her well. Please let her ladies, have the best food. Please, let her have the nicest rooms. But if you allow her to take orders, I will excommunicate you. So why? Why did he want to keep her out of the nunnery? He's a pope. And this is, again, one of these moments where we can only sort of fill in speculatively what we think might have happened, because he didn't explain. He didn't explain why. All we know is that in subsequent years, he was very often in communication with her directly, as was his successor, about different political negotiations going on with her family's territories. So they were the largest landowners outside of the Pope in that entire region. Her brother was absolutely insane and horrible to deal with. And so when, for example, in 1540, a war broke out between, it was called the Salt Wars over the taxes, it was sort of like the Boston Tea Party, the taxes that were being levied on salt. The Holy Roman Emperor wrote to Vittoria Colonna and said, you're the only one we can negotiate with. You're the only one who can resolve this. So she was obviously incredibly valuable as the head of the family. Her parents were dead. Her brother was very, very erratic and unreliable. So the last thing the Pope wanted was for her to be locked up in a convent. Anyway, I'm her biographer, and I'm explaining the best thing I can, but I'm not certain. I'm convinced this is the best explanation, but I'm not certain why. Thank you. Yeah, there's a hand here.
Hi.
Maybe just speak. Okay.
Thanks. Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I wondered what happened after she died. What did she leave besides, the things she wrote? Was there a circle of people that liked her or had, she had influenced in some way? What happened?
Yeah, no, so I mentioned that before she died, there were 9 editions of her poems published. They continued to be published quite regularly for the next decade or two. When all of this religious upheaval happened, there was a lull in her publication, and she was published less frequently. But composers wrote music to her sonnets. So there were musical adaptations, and as I briefly mentioned, many women poets and playwrights said that they could never, in their letters of dedicatory, they could never have done this without the example of the divine Vittoria Colonna. So she left an enormous legacy, a literary legacy, and she was never forgotten. I mean, if you look at the publication history, it slows down, but she didn't disappear out of print. So her name continued on. Oh, okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all for coming.